What does psychology say about our perceptions about rewards and suffering? I'm Marco Perri. Welcome to the Perri platform. I came across a pretty interesting study that was put out in the British Journal of Social Psychology, and I felt like it warranted a discussion. It's titled, Why and When Suffering Increases the Perceived Likelihood of Fortuitous Rewards, and maybe we should just explain too what that title means. So fortuitous rewards is the operative term there. Fortuitous just means by luck, so happening by chance. When does the perception of suffering make someone believe that your odds of success are going to increase, essentially? Centrally, the theme here is that the researchers find cultural practices and anecdotal accounts suggest that people expect suffering to lead to these fortuitous rewards, and maybe you can see where that comes from. They go beyond that too in the study. They talk about why it's beneficial and whatnot, but just to begin very broadly with that statement, if you are suffering, something good's coming down the line. That's basically what it's getting at here, and it turns out, possibly, that affects the way people perceive the world, that thought, and it also impacts how they're going to operate. What they've stumbled upon here may actually be psychological fundamental dogmas that are deeply ingrained in our minds. I believe there is validity here. I think the researchers may have erred by calling it the belief in fortuitous rewards though, fortuitous once again being the operative term. That strikes me as a mischaracterization of what really goes on, but I'll get to that a bit later. I just want to talk about the study right now. So the study starts off with that hypothesis that people are trying to fundamentally do one thing by holding on to that belief that the more suffering you encounter, the better things are going to be for you in the long run, essentially. Individuals seek to uphold that theory because they're trying to preserve a certain outlook on the world. They call it the just world perspective or the just world theory. What that is pretty simple. It's a world perspective that lays out the entire universe is something akin to a fair game. That if things are going rough for you right now, down the line, things will get better. This perspective doesn't want to acknowledge the fact that the world can be fundamentally unfair to some people, and it tries to uphold a certain golden hue, a certain patina to the way the world is established and the way it functions. You can see why the link between suffering and rewards is critical to having that worldview not be tarnished if people are actually out here, in fact, suffering for no good reason, and nothing good is coming down the line because of that. Well, we can't say the world is just then. We can make the claim that it's just if things are going to work out, if there are rewards waiting for them somewhere along the path, but if there aren't, well, you throw the entire theory out then. The researchers took that framework and they extracted two ways of expressing the idea, and they used these methods in their testing. The first way the belief can manifest is that people might tend to conceptualize the world in a way where they believe suffering deserves to be compensated. The second interpretation is that suffering indicates virtue and will be rewarded because of that. Already here, I think the study is making a mistake. Fundamentally, I don't think suffering is the right word. Neither is fortuitous. Sacrifice is a more applicable term. The link between sacrifice and reward is far more easy to try and understand. I want to save the rest of my take for later, but briefly I'll say here that if you stub your toe on a desk while you're walking by it, that is suffering. Nobody expects a reward from that. Further, a fortuitous one. But if you stub your toe because you were kicking away a ball that was heading towards your pet, it's still suffering there, but a reward is certainly going to manifest. In the situation, the suffering isn't simply suffering. It was a sacrifice. You traded your immediate well-being for the protection of your pet. That's very different, and once again, it wasn't fortuitous. The reward was something you aimed at. It was something intended. The sky didn't open up and a lottery was held where this outcome was the plinko ball that fell out. You knew what you were going to do. You were going to sacrifice your immediate well-being to protect someone else, and that's the reward, their protection. These concepts seem to be amalgamated in the study, and that's a big mistake. Also, there's another caveat here. It depends what the researchers are going to classify as a reward. If I put my hand on a hot stove and suffer as a result, do I get any reward? Think about that. The answer is I do actually get a reward. I have learned, I have gained knowledge. I know now that by putting my hand here on the stove, it will burn. So, it's probably a good idea to avoid doing that in the future. Perhaps you can say the reward here is the knowledge needed not to harm myself again in the future via this method. And once again, that wouldn't be fortuitous. There's no random draw, random chance here. It's an intended outcome. It's predictable that you will gain that by going through that suffering experience. Now, in regards to the second thesis they put out, linking suffering to virtue, here the suffering had nothing to do with virtue. Burning my hand was simply folly. That was a lack of good judgment on my part. The two are not inextricably linked, suffering and virtue. Sacrifice, though, that is a far better argument. It inherently implies the giving up of something now for something better in the future. Me being frugal and not spending my money on an ice cream cone, instead saving it and investing it into the future where it will theoretically grow and be a larger sum. That's virtuous. Me studying, giving up short-term pleasure so I can do good on a test and hopefully get an education and a degree so I can get a good career, that's virtuous. Sacrifice is a very different concept, and I feel like that nuance was not accounted for. Fundamentally, suffering is just pain. Now, it could be virtuous or it could not be. It's not always going to go down that path. Anyways, I'll get back to that. The study's objective is to figure out the benefits of viewing the world like this. They say, first of all, that the suffering reward framework is illusory. It's a figment of your imagination, it's an illusion, but it can help people cope with the threats that attack their worldview. If you subscribe to the just world theory, where you think the world is in fact just, well, you need something to negate the very obvious suffering of innocent people. And second, it can help individuals also handle suffering when it occurs even though it was not caused by themselves. So if you're the victim of misfortune, you can put a virtuous spin on it. You can say something good is coming down the line, and it will help you cope. So, in summary, this link between suffering and rewards is an illusion, but it's a useful one. It gives you the benefit of, I guess in the sense, being somewhat naive to the realities of the world, staying in your bubble, but you're able to preserve the just world theory, which is very upbeat, very happy, and it can make your journey easier. And the second thing is, when you encounter suffering, you can tell yourself that same story, and it'll help you power through it. Now, I'll jump in here again and say this. I do actually agree that the suffering reward framework is illusory. But how about the sacrifice reward framework? Is that also illusory? I don't think so. They may have been approaching the study with the wrong framework in mind. And I'll touch on that. Actually, maybe I should go into it now. So, okay. Suffering reward. We already know that just because you suffer doesn't mean a reward is going to be coming your way. There are instances where you can learn from it, but how about a child born in complete destitution? What reward is coming their way? They can learn from that how to not be in poverty in the future. The environment around them is going to dictate that for them. And at the same time, just because you are suffering, it does not make you virtuous or your environment virtuous. It could actually be just pure malevolence going on there. Now, because the study used a different perspective than I would have, you can see why the end results are different also than what I would arrive at. So I would say, yes, the suffering reward framework is illusory, but the sacrifice reward framework is not. Then they would say, the suffering reward framework is good for people who want to live in the bubble of the just world theory, where the world is ripe with justice and whatnot. I would not say that, because the sacrifice reward framework has nothing to do with it. And the same goes with the last point of virtue. Virtue is not a relevant consideration when we're talking about suffering for the most part. It could be here and there, but with sacrifice, it is. So I would like to begin by just addressing the just world theory. It's obviously false. There's no logical person who should be subscribing to that. For the entirety of human existence, the world has never been just. There have been children. who die due to disease. There have been mothers who die while giving birth. There have been natural disasters that destroy homes. There has been famines. There has been so many things that happen to people. No matter how you try to rationalize it, it is not just. The world is not set up in that way. But I will temper that. Justice isn't a sort of thing that has to be absolute. It's either there or it's not. It's here in degrees, and it has become more so as of late. So, at the dawn of inception, the human was very susceptible to the environment. That was the ruler. That was the chaos that either killed you or let you thrive. Then, as we got better adapted to it, some of that malevolence was shared from the environment to other people. There were rulers and kings who could make your life a hell. The environment could too, but now the power was shared. There were very few people who could even conceptualize a just world. Maybe the elites. And then you had the serfs, the slaves, the common folk. They did not enjoy that same bliss of having the ability to envision a just reality, because to them, it was just an illusion, as the article says. Then, as time progressed, things like our medicine got better. There were less children dying out of whatever complications arise during their birth. There were more people who got rights. First it was the average man, then the average woman, and then it spread across culture, race, and whatever classification you want to use. Now, given all of that, the world is still not just. There are still terrible calamities that can occur. There is still great evil that can be inflicted upon you by other people, the environment, whatever. It'll still hurt you the same ways it would a million years ago. There is still a sliver of justice in the equation though, and the sliver gets bigger progressively as we advance as a civilization. The average person in North America can commit these various sacrifices to get to a reasonably good place when put into context with standards across all of human existence, that you can't say there is no justice there. There is, but it's not perfect. Now, that cannot be said about suffering. You can suffer all you want, and you may never inherit anything. But if you are properly sacrificing though, well, you're going to get something. Because that's how the mechanism works. You're giving up something now in the hopes of getting something better in the future. Here's a fact. If you are someone who is willing to put in the time, work, and the effort to do certain things, I believe there are 3 things you have to do in America to become an average citizen. The first thing is to graduate high school. Second thing, I believe, is to not have a child out of wedlock. There's some other things too. If you can follow these simple principles here, you will do well. I'm not saying well in terms of making $100,000 a year. I'm not saying well in terms of being able to afford having a family at a young age. I'm saying, I think the other thing is get married, so you have 2 incomes. So, if you can do that, given the vast complexities of the world, you will be fine. You will not be living lavishly. You will not be Bill Gates, and that could be an issue in and of itself. I'm willing to debate the income inequality thing. But the average person in America or Canada or in Europe today is living like royalty when compared to the average human of 100 or 200 years ago. Then you expand that to 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago. Humanity's been around for a very long time. We've experienced a relative burst in wealth and well-being only recently. That's something approximating a just world, given the constraints that we have. Of course, we can always do better, but there are things you can sacrifice now to move yourself towards a higher level. Society is going to move as it does throughout time, but you can alter your position as well. You can sacrifice the leisure time and study. You can sacrifice whatever you want to do. Pick up a course or something valuable. You can pursue meaningful relationships. You can do what you want to do, and that all comes with a cost, a sacrifice of some sort. But that's the way the world works. I don't think it's an illusion to say that the sacrifice reward framework actually produces tangible benefits to people. If you are willing to sacrifice short-term pleasures now, gratification now, and do things that will benefit your future self will have benefits there and rewards to reap. Now, it's going to vary based on the individual. I'm not saying you're going to be a millionaire, but you can 100% do better than where you are now via this mechanism. It is a folly statement to say that the world is just 100%, but it is somewhat just, especially when compared to the recent past, and even now compared to the rest of the world. There are some places where it's more just than others. I think you have to understand that nuance, ascribing to the general theme of the entire universe, is working in this miraculous way where everyone has something good coming to them, is false. You can make things good for yourself. You have the ability to do so here, but in some places it's not the case. And for you to baby your mind and pretend like that's the case everywhere, that all over the world, everyone has these same luxuries as they do in North America, or even the other 99% of all humans who ever lived have the same luxuries we have today, it's just false. The world has been nothing but unfair to them, and you should realize that. Be thankful for where you are today, and strive to make this common for all humanity. The notion that suffering will inherently be rewarded is an illusion. The fact that sacrifice will be rewarded in some places in the world is not an illusion. Saying that that even applies around everywhere across the globe, that would be an illusion. So there's so much nuance here. But if you're listening to this podcast, it's almost a guarantee that some personal sacrifice can elevate you to a level that you would say is more just than the position you were in before. There will be innocent victims down the line. There will be innocent victims that you encounter, and there are some right now that you are unaware of. For you to say that they have rewards coming because their suffering is not helpful to anyone. Instead, realize that the just world theory does not apply to everyone equally and doesn't apply to anyone perfectly. So, given that, instead of saying that they will be rewarded at some point somewhere, the onus really is on us to do something, not just to brush it off saying some cosmic ray will take care of it for them. It's actually on us to put them in a position where they're able to believe again in perhaps the just world theory. It's a privilege to be able to do that. Now, I will say, even though I'm tearing it apart kind of, I'm not saying that nobody subscribes to it. It's a very common line of thinking, I believe, the just world theory, that suffering produces rewards, that there is virtue in suffering. That's very common among very religious people. It's a religious type of viewpoint that, first of all, those who are suffering will perhaps be rewarded in the afterlife. Maybe now things are bad. You can see the dissonance there. So, they can realize that the suffering people are encountering right now in certain parts of the world is terrible, it's horrible, and they don't really have the power to do anything about it. So, to put their mind at ease, they say, it's okay. In the next life, they will be rewarded, everything will come to them, and that puts a certain veil over your eyes because now you're viewing it through a certain mystical lens. You're saying, hey, it doesn't actually matter anymore what's going on today because at some point you will reach nirvana and everything will be bliss. That's quite a dangerous thing to tell yourself though because it inhibits action. You might be able to lull yourself into a false sense of security, a false sense of accepting the injustices of the world because you think it doesn't matter right now because there's something waiting. But what if there isn't? What if this suffering is very real, very important to fix right now, but you've told yourself this riddle, this tale that makes it far more palatable. And because of that, you become somewhat sedentary. Then tying in the notion of virtue, I believe it was actually Mother Teresa who was saying crazy stuff like suffering is cleansing. She was trying to preach, trying to acquire it as much as you could and whatnot. Now, there's a difference between suffering for the sake of suffering and suffering for the sake of sacrifice where you're trying to get something better down the line. Having this infatuation with a holy hue, the mystique of suffering, is not a good thing because we actually do want to limit it, not to indulge in it excessively because we think there is this type of mystical aura to it, that there are these heavenly properties to taking part in excess suffering. It could get kind of cultish. So with that in mind, I will say that I can understand where it comes from, but the framework doesn't hold up. Now, the second thing they say in the study, the other benefit of perceiving the world through this lens that suffering equals rewards, is it helps people handle their own suffering. Especially when it's not caused by their own actions, helps them rationalize what's going on. If something very bad happens to you, you can tell yourself, it's okay, it's part of the plan, something good is waiting for me down the line. And that might be true actually, but here I think it's important to make a distinction as well. There is the suffering caused by evil and malevolence and the suffering caused by catastrophe. So, what's the difference here? A hurricane destroying your house will produce suffering, but that's a catastrophe. Somebody taking a blowtorch and lighting your house on fire is suffering, but that's evil. So what's the difference? Your house is still burned down or destroyed in either scenario. The difference is suffering for the sake of suffering and the ability to not have done it. There is no controlling the hurricane. It was going to happen no matter what we did. It was the force of nature that has been around since the dawn of human life and perhaps the dawn of the universe. Now, the person, though, who went to your house and intentionally destroyed it for presumably the sake of making you suffer, that's evil, simply because it need not happen. It is the suffering that is intentionally caused to other human beings. That's very, very sinister. Dealing with something like a catastrophe should be a lot easier to handle because these things you really did have no power to control, and it was not caused by you, it was not caused by another human. Your love for the human race itself should not be tarnished because of that. When another individual is harming you, though, out of malice, and it didn't have to happen, they were simply doing it because they wanted you to suffer, that's very damaging. It can taint the way you view other people. It can hurt you internally. It can make it very hard to trust individuals again. That's the type of suffering where you need additional resources to cope. I don't really think the suffering equals rewards framework is the best way of handling that, though. So, it is true that you're going through a very tough time right now. Telling yourself that something good is waiting for you down the line might help you get through it, but I also believe that being real to yourself is important as well. Recognize the event for what it was. It was horrible. You perhaps had nothing to do with it. It was just sheer bad luck. Whatever it is. Now, there is a certain way for you to ensure you get a reward. Simply telling yourself you will isn't enough. If you learn from it, if you make yourself better, if you develop as a human, these are very valid rewards that you can get, but it takes some effort. Simply believing in the theory, simply thinking that things will come to you without you putting in the effort, it's not going to happen. And here's my issue with the word fortuitous again. They're saying it as if you do have to believe that chance will take care of it, that something will come to you via magic. It's not true. Take fortuitous out of the equation. If you have an intention, if you aim at a reward, that's a far better gambit. Say you want to learn from it. Say you want to get better. Say you want to develop and have a goal. And if you move towards it, you will taste that reward. It's better than leaving it up to chance. Now, I know I went on a little bit too long there, but back to the experiment. So it was actually a 3-phase trial. The first 2 experiments, the first 2 phases were a failure. The researchers did not find significant evidence that people believe suffering individuals are bound for fortuitous rewards, but they still came to that conclusion. How is that? Because of the 3rd phase. They were able to tweak the experiment as they went along. Essentially, to put it simply, the reason for the failure is because they didn't differentiate clearly between self-inflicted suffering, suffering caused beyond one's control, and stochastic suffering, which is essentially based on random probability distribution. So something that's going to happen to a set amount of people, things that you do to yourself, and things that are beyond your control, like disasters and stuff like that. Interestingly enough, people have a different framework for interpreting these things here, and because they weren't differentiating it before, the results all got muddled together. So the main 2 is the self-inflicted suffering and the suffering caused beyond your control. People have different ways of interpreting that. If you do something to yourself that leads to suffering, they're less forgiving. They're less willing to attribute rewards coming to you. They are less willing to rationalize the experience because it may not actually infringe upon the just world theory. The just world theory is concerned with innocent people, people who did nothing but got screwed over. The individual who was going about their life and they get hit by a car out of the blue, bad things happening to them, that requires more rationalization. But if you are an individual who is seeking trouble, for example, somebody who, I'm trying to think of an example actually, self-inflicted. Perhaps you've been warned that your diet is unhealthy, but you refuse to change your mind or something like that. You refuse to get back on track even though you're aware of the faults of your actions. Well, people will be far less willing to say something good's coming your way. And it won't bother them as much. It won't shatter their just world framework because in a sense, maybe they're saying that individual deserved it. It was self-inflicted after all. Now, when you correct for that and you focus on the type of pain, whatever that is attributable to things beyond one's control, that's when you see the just world framework. That's when you see the suffering reward framework coming into action. People using it far more often. I found that interesting because at the beginning it was laid out as if people had problems with suffering in general, but when you break that down, it really isn't the case. If you do something to yourself and they can say you deserved it, or it was coming your way, you had the ability to change, but you did not, they don't really care as much. But if things happen to you out of the blue, there are tragedies, it's pure malevolence, well, that's where they need a way to rationalize it. Because the event is so damaging, it not only hurts you, it hurts their framework of interpretation, which I've already laid out, I think is wrong to begin with, but nevertheless, they're looking for ways to make it work again. They're not trying to change frameworks when an error is exposed to it, but instead, they're trying to find ways to put up a wall so they never have to see the cracks in it. And that's what's going on here. Now, just to summarize what I've laid out, I feel like fundamentally, the report makes sense given the way they phrased it, but the way they phrased it isn't what I would have done. Sacrifice is the right term here. Suffering, not so much, and I see why they've gone down this rabbit hole, but it leads you to something of a mess. People fixated on the just world theory, believing in things that are perhaps not logical, trying to uphold a framework that maybe has a lot of holes in it, but if we simply change the dichotomy to sacrifice and reward, it's far more logical. There's far more evidence for it, and it's far more empowering. Simply saying because you are suffering something good is coming, that's not true. But if you are sacrificing properly, well, by definition, you are aiming towards something better in the future. And for the most part, you can get there. Now, there is inequality in terms of where you can get. I'm not one to say that poor people have to, tie their bootstraps up and get going. That can help, but it's not the final answer, but it's a part of the equation. And to disregard it, that's not a good idea. There is immense power in this, and I know I've talked about religion before. They may have gone astray with the just world theory, but there are actually proponents as well of the sacrifice reward mechanism. We see that throughout things like the Bible. So it's a mixed bag, as it always is. Things that are very good, things that are more debatable. The very good, though, should be preserved and advocated for. I would have loved to see a study on the sacrifice reward mechanism and how people use that to interpret the world and how much more valid that might be versus the suffering reward mechanism or interpretation structure. My second issue with the way the report was laid out was that it harped a lot on fortuitous, by chance, things that are unintended. Is that really how people operate, though? Or perhaps when they are suffering, or better yet, sacrificing, they're not banking on a fortuitous reward, and they're aiming at a particular one. Something that's not completely random or up to chance, something that they have planned out and are moving towards. And then you also have that interesting result here where they did multiple experiments at the beginning that failed. They didn't produce the results they wanted because they did not differentiate the suffering. They later found out, hey, people actually act differently based on self-inflicted tales of suffering versus ones that are beyond the individual's control. And that, I think, has a whole debate wrapped up in it. To what degree is someone actually responsible for the suffering they stumble upon? Going back to the story about I was laying out with the individual who knows their diet is terrible, but they refuse to change their mind. Why are they refusing to change their mind? See, you wouldn't know that, but you would still cast a judgment based on the fact that it's perceived self-inflicted. Is it because they don't have the means to change? And the money, the time, the resources, whatever it is? Is it maybe because their body is genetically geared to putting on extra weight, even though their diet could be the same as yours? And this level of nuance is actually present in virtually all circumstances, so maybe the main message here is we should not be so judgmental. We should not be so quick to try and explain away the pain of other people, to tell ourselves that rewards are coming down the line so we feel better about what's happening and our views of the world are not shattered. It's actually a very big problem that's illustrated here. The tendency to not seek out where your views are wrong, but instead to hide behind a fallacy or a framework or a wall to preserve it, even though there are clear issues within it. There isn't a goal or a drive to find the truth. It's complacency, being comfortable with the way that you see the world and not wanting to change that. You see it on the right and the left, you see it everywhere. And the funny thing is, people are even oblivious to that. So, yeah, this article has a lot of things wrapped up in it. I think that does it for the discussion for today, though. It was a pleasure talking about this. Now, if you enjoyed the content, be sure to leave a review and share. That'll help us grow. And you can find me online at perriplatform.org and on social media at perriplatform. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.